If you have any experience teaching children about God, and maybe adults too, you're familiar with the following exchange. It goes something like this. Does God know what I'm thinking right now? Yes. Well, how about now? Yeah. Well, what about? Yes. So I should be really careful about my next thought. Well, yeah, to be sure. That was how the previous episode of 167 started. Did God know I was going to say that? Did God make me say that? If I believe in the omniscient ability of God to know all things, past, present, and future, then I have to say yes to the first question. God knew I was going to say that. And presumably the all-powerful, the omnipotent God could have led me to say something else. A little trickier question is this. If God knew I was going to say that, then did he make me say that? In the deterministic view of God's universe, he exercises meticulous control of everything, from who is going to believe in the gospel and respond to Jesus Christ, all the way down to the next word that I'm going to say. Of course, this perfectly satisfies the orthodox doctrine of omniscience. If God has determined everything that will happen from creation to the final seconds of history, then it's easy to see how God can know all things, past and present. But what if the future is more open than you and I think? Let's talk about it. Welcome back to 167, where we don't separate theology from daily life. Knowing God and knowing about God are the most important things that we can do as followers of Christ. And not just that, but also as human beings existing in a world that he created and God controls. In our last episode, we explored the topic of omniscience. And listen, if you haven't watched it yet, I would encourage you to pause this and go back and view that episode. That video will give you the lay of the land on what it means for God to know all things. Almost universally through the centuries, Christians have been very comfortable acknowledging God's perfect and complete knowledge of all things, past and present. For much of the history of Christianity, Christians were also comfortable with the idea of God's perfect and complete knowledge of the future, of all events that are still yet to happen. A recent theological doctrine concerning future knowledge argues simply that with regard to the future, there's nothing to know if the future hasn't happened yet. This movement is known as open theism. Rather than me define it and possibly misspeak, I'm going to use as the definition the words of Clark Pinnock, one of the movement's chief proponents. The late Dr. Pinnock said of the open theists, "Our understanding of the scriptures leads us to depict God, the sovereign creator, as voluntarily bringing into existence a world with significantly free personal agents in it. Agents who can respond positively to God, or they can reject God's plans for themselves. God rules," this is Pinnock continuing, "God rules in such a way as to uphold the created structures. And because he gives the liberty to his creatures, is happy to accept the future as open and not closed, in a relationship with the world that is dynamic and not static." Pinnock continues, "We believe that the Bible presents an open view of God as living and active, involved in history, relating to us, and changing in relation to us. The open theists see the universe as a context in which there are real choices, real alternatives, and real surprises. God's openness means that he's open to the changing realities of history, that they believe that God cares about us in this open context and lets what we do impact him. Now, I know that's a lengthy and complex definition, so let me add the more succinct words of another proponent of open theism, Gregory Boyd, who says simply of this notion, we live in a universe where possibilities are real. In another way of saying that, God created the world to have real possibilities. If we look at this logically, then Pennock's assertion about the openness of God makes perfect sense. This logic rests on three things. Number one, true libertarian human freedom only exists if the future is open. The second premise says if God possesses extensive knowledge of the future, then it can't be open. Now, why do I say that? If people lack the ability, I'll say it differently, if people lack the freedom to do anything other than what God already knows, well, then they're not truly free creatures. That, of course, leads to the third premise. If humans are completely free, then God can't know the future. Watch, because it rests upon the outcome of the choices that those free humans will make. And humans haven't made those choices yet. If this sounds like a powerless God, Boyd is quick to defend him. Boyd says if God does not foreknow future free actions, it's not because his knowledge of the future is in any sense incomplete. Watch this now. It's because there is, in this view, in the open theist view, it's because there is nothing definite in the future for God to know. Do you see the logic at work here? If the infallible God knows the future completely, this means that he knows the choices and the outcomes of all of his creatures. And it also means that the future is fixed and it's unchangeable. That brings you back around to the question of your ability to make free will choices. The open theists argue that your choices are not real if God already knows what you're going to choose, and then, of course, what the outcome will be. The question we ask as good theologians is not does this logic and philosophy work out, but what does the Bible say? It's probably a good idea to watch the rest of this episode with your Bible close by so you can go to the verses we're pointing to. So first, the open theist, he begins very simply, pointing to Genesis 6, 5 through 7. And there we find a God who regrets what he's done. The Lord appears to discover that sin that is infecting humankind is pervasive, and it has caused all their choices to be evil. Did God not foresee this at creation, or was it an outcome of the choice to sin that occurred back in the garden? This discovery of wickedness that we're presented with leads to God regretting that he had created humankind. And regret is only possible when there's something regrettable, when a different choice or outcome could have been possible. Again, given this possibility, did God not foresee the regrettable outcome of the free choices of his creatures? Finally, the open theist walks us to the next verse where God makes the choice to eradicate the sinful creatures from his world. And again, the open view says that God must make such a violent choice because of the human choices over which he had no control. Now, this is not to say that open theism is fatalistic. Most of these theologians allow that God does know all the possible choices and all the outcomes that his creatures can make. He just does not know which of those choices they'll make until they make the choice. The God of open theism also learns as history unfolds and humans make their choices. Genesis 22:10 through 12. So we're going to talk about Abraham here. God responds to the choice that he has demanded from Abraham. Looking at the full story, the whole pericope there, which the NIV helpfully entitles Abraham Tested, in case you didn't get the hint. God wants to see the degree of Abraham's love and devotion for him, since he wants to use Abraham to bless all the peoples through all of history. And so he demands that Abraham sacrifice his beloved son, Isaac. As the story unfolds, we, of course, see Abraham being immediately obedient to this demand. But not without stress. I mean, Abraham is not happy about having to make this choice. He comes all the way to the point of raising the knife to plunge into Isaac when God intervenes through an angel. Now, as the open theists view this interaction, the fact that God is even testing Abraham means that he doesn't know which choice Abraham will make. At the conclusion of the story, that is the raising of the blade, God has learned that Abraham's devotion and love for him are complete. As open theist doctrine asserts, God genuinely does not know what Abraham will do until he does it. Would Abraham obey? Apparently, it turns out that he would. But what if he didn't? This view of God also finds him taking risks with creation. If we turn a few pages back in Genesis, we find the story of the Garden of Eden, where God has established the conditions in which a loving and trusting relationship between himself and the humans that he brings into existence could exist. And God fully expects that this relationship will develop. And as we read the narrative, there seems to be no reason to suspect that any other possibility will come about. It doesn't seem plausible that in these perfect conditions there would be a break in the relationship, considering all the good things that God had done for those creatures. But of course, then the unexpected happens. The two humans who were in perfect relationship with God break that relationship. So is God really caught by surprise here? These are the basic arguments that open theism uses to deny the future component of God's omniscience. And listen, that's important. Open theism does not challenge the perfect and exhaustive knowledge that God has of the past and of the present. They are only concerned with the openness of the future. Human free will choices and possibilities that are real can't coexist with a future in which all of those choices and these possibilities and even their outcomes are already known, which means they're fixed. This limitation to God's future knowledge it's not total. As I mentioned a minute ago, the open theists do allow for God to know a portion of the future, those things that he controls without human intervention. Say the end of time. That alone, the Bible is absolutely crystal clear. That is God's decision, God the Father's decision alone. So given all this, in this view, the future of the open theist is open. It's open. It hasn't happened yet. There's nothing for God to know, and it depends on human choices. Now, this is not a free decision. This has implications that go far beyond omniscience that you really need to consider. Given the logic, the philosophy, and the biblical examples, is open theism biblical and therefore correct? In the broadest sense, open theism brings into question all prophecy. How does the open theist read Revelation, for example? Does God know right now that all free human choices will lead perfectly to the outcome that was revealed to St. John? In fact, all of open theism collapses if the Bible can show even a single instance of God having comprehensive knowledge of the future. More than a single example, the theologians who support full omniscience, including foreknowledge, say that the biblical example is overwhelmingly in favor of their position. So let's look at some of the orthodox theologians' examples. One of the clearest and easiest to understand, even though you've got to wade through a lot of scripture, is found in Isaiah chapters 40 through 48, where it tells of Yahweh putting false idols on trial and demanding that they prove, these false idols can match any of the divine power that God alone possesses. To our topic, one of the challenges that the false gods are given is that they must show any proof of their ability to dictate or just even know the future. Within these chapters are multiple separate sections where the point that Isaiah is making is that God uses his knowledge and control of the future as a point of contrast in this section between himself, the true and living God, and these idols who are useless, meaningless, that's better. The argument is presented from both perspectives, and that is that the idols are imposters, unworthy of worship, because they don't know any portion of the future, and they certainly have no power to bring events about. And even though we don't have time to delve into the specific passages that support full omniscience, there are a couple of things to take note of as you read these texts. First, all of the specific predictions given by God involve future free choices and future actions of human beings in order for them to be fulfilled. You make note of that. Consider how many free will choices are involved in the rise and fall of nations. Think about how many free will choices that human beings have to make that are involved in the choice of a future king. You know, not only are the free will choices of human beings real in this passage, but the truth of God's knowledge of their outcome is also demonstrated to be true. The second thing to take note of in this group of passages is that God is not only demonstrating his power, but proving that he is the only omnipotent, omniscient being simply by declaring what the future will be. The idols are worthy only of destruction and being thrown into the fire. Psalm 139 it's not just a great comfort for the people of God, but it speaks of God's knowledge of all of your ways, all of our ways. Verse 4, for example, before a word is on my tongue, you know it completely, O Lord. How can we read a text like that and not credit God with knowing all things future? Certainly God is not guessing what we're going to say. This knowledge of future actions even extends to my movements, my getting up and my sitting down, my thoughts and the paths in life I'll choose. This comprehensive and meticulous knowledge of all my ways should give me the great comfort that I mentioned a moment ago. Run your finger down to verse 16. Your eyes saw my unformed body. Now, that could be past, but it could be future too. I haven't been formed yet. All the days ordained for me, and the question you stop and outline that is who ordained those days? The days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. Listen, if the days of my life and your life are a mystery to God, until they come to pass, how else can we interpret this clear statement of God's ability? When we meditate on just that truth, what confidence we gain. Our lives are no secret to God. Our future is no secret to God. A beautiful, wonderful trust can be established only in a God that has the knowledge of what's to come, and then promises that he will work all things that are about to come for good in my life and your life. The Bible has, countless further scriptural examples that support the orthodox view of God's full omniscience. The open theist makes a reasonable case for his position, and we'll talk more about, free will and determinism down the road. But as practical theologians, people who want to know how this applies to our day-to-day lives, we find that the damage done to our lives as Christians when we adopt the open theism is much greater than accepting God's meticulous foreknowledge without the need to understand completely how he does it. Just think about your prayer life. Your prayer life would be meaningless and really even a little suspicious if God has already determined the outcome of all things. God, could be seen as a little hypocritical to invite human beings to pray and seek maybe the salvation of a loved one when, listen, he's already determined who's going to be saved and who's not. Our confidence in the promises of God would be rattled, I think is a good way to put it. We'd be shook up if there was no possible way that God can assure us that his good conclusion to history is going to come out. Thanks for watching this lengthy episode of 167. We try to present these topics in short little bites so that you can just get the key pieces of each topic that we cover. Every topic, every video that we put out, every one of these theological topics could consume you for weeks and even years in the case of open theism, studying this. So take these as an invitation to study further. I know this is a complicated topic, and we've just had enough time to survey it. Ultimately, ultimately, given God's goodness, I think we do best to trust in the simple witness of the Bible. Even if I can't understand how God knows the future or how the future comes about, I can trust in a God who gave his son as a sacrifice for my salvation. Maybe that's the best place to stand. Thanks for watching. God's richest blessing to you.